I've talked about Endfield before, and I've already been pretty clear about some of the things that didn't work for me early on, especially how the protagonist is portrayed and how the story initially develops. So for this video, I want to set that aside. I just finished the main story of the first region, and I want to talk about it for what it actually is, not as a response to my earlier frustrations, and not as a verdict on where the story will eventually end up. Overall, I enjoyed it. By the time the region wraps up, there isn't a big emotional release or a dramatic turning point. And honestly, that didn't bother me. This story doesn't feel like it's trying to make a statement yet, it feels like it's still introducing itself. What this first region really does is establish a baseline. It gives you a sense of the world, the tone it's aiming for, and the kind of pacing the story is comfortable with. When it ends, it feels less like something concluded and more like something finally put into place. And that's why my reaction coming out of this was fairly neutral. Not because it failed to land, but because it wasn't aiming to land hard in the first place. It feels like the game finishing its opening move. So in this video, I want to talk about how that opening works, what kind of foundation is laying down, and whatever the groundwork feels strong enough to support what comes next. One of the most important things to understand about Enfield's first region is that it isn't trying to tell a complete story yet. There is a central conflict, there are clear stakes, and the region does reach a stopping point. But the focus isn't on escalation or payoff, it's on context. On giving you enough information to understand where you are, who holds the power, and why any of this might matter later. Most of the storytelling energy here goes into establishing the setting and its rules, the factions, the tension between them, the way authority operates, and the limits of what the characters can actually do within this space. The story is much more interested in positioning than in resolution. That's why the pacing feels restrained for most of the region. Major developments are spaced out, and a lot of time is spent letting situations breathe instead of pushing towards a dramatic turning point. For some players that might feel uneventful. For me, it felt intentional. This region is doing the work of making the world feel inhabitable. By the time it ends, you have a clear sense of the environment the story wants to operate in. Not just geographically, but emotionally and politically as well. You know what kind of conflicts are possible here, and just as importantly, what kind of conflicts are not going to be resolved easily. That's also why the ending doesn't aim for a strong emotional response. It wraps up the immediate situation, but it leaves most of the larger questions untouched. Rather than closing doors, it quietly opens several more, then steps back. Taken on its own, that can feel understated. But as an opening act, it does exactly what it needs to do. It stabilizes the narrative space so the story can actually move forward without constantly reintroducing itself. What stood out to me most about this first region is how balanced the pacing felt, at least when you look at the story on its own terms. The narrative never rushes to explain itself, but it also doesn't stall. Information is introduced when it becomes relevant, not dumped all at once, and not delayed for artificial tension. There's a steady forward movement throughout the region that makes it easy to stay engaged without feeling pushed. Now, it's worth separating the story from the game around it. The tutorials and mechanics, especially the factory systems, do slow things down, sometimes quite a bit. That's unavoidable in the early hours of a game like this, and those interruptions definitely affect how the story feels while you're playing. But if you isolate the narrative itself, if you imagine this as a story removed from the onboarding and the systems, the pacing holds up remarkably well. It reads cleanly and moves when it needs to move and pauses when it needs to establish context. Another thing I really appreciate is how much control the game gives you over how you experience the story. You're not locked into a fixed reading speed. You can move through dialogue at your own pace, skim when things are familiar, and slow down when something actually catches your attention. What makes that especially interesting is that the game still puts effort into presentation. Even fairly mundane interactions are framed cinematically, with deliberate camera angles and staging. There's a clear attempt to make scenes feel authored rather than purely functional. And yet, crucially, the game doesn't force you to linger on that presentation. If you want to take it in, you can. If you want to move on, the story lets you do that. That flexibility goes a long way towards keeping the pacing comfortable instead of frustrating. Taken together, it creates a storytelling rhythm that feels confident, not showy, not rushed, just controlled in a way that makes the early hours feel intentional rather than bloated. When it comes to creative identity, this first region doesn't really give me anything new to hold on to. And I don't mean that as an attack, it's more of an observation. Playing through it, there's a constant sense of familiarity, not in a bad way, but in a very recognizable gacha way. The structure, the tone, the way the story unfolds, it all feels like something I've seen before. If you've played a few gacha games, you already understand the rhythm this story is working with. And honestly, that's part of why it works as smoothly as it does. The story doesn't fight the genre, it doesn't try to subvert expectations or push against established patterns. It settles into them. You move through the region, get introduced to the world, meet the cast, resolve the immediate situation, and walk away with more questions than answers. It's competent, clean, and easy to engage with, especially if this kind of storytelling is already your comfort zone. At the same time, there's nothing here that really stands out creatively. No strong hook that makes you stop and think this feels different. No moment where the story asserts a distinct identity beyond being another gacha narrative doing its job well enough. For me, that creates a very specific reaction. Enjoyment without excitement. I like playing it, I'm interested enough to keep going, but I'm not surprised by it. It doesn't challenge the genre and it doesn't redefine anything. It simply delivers a familiar experience in a polished way. And depending on how you look at it, that can go either way. If you enjoy gacha storytelling, and clearly I do, this is perfectly fine. It gives you exactly what you expect, without major missteps. But if you're looking for something that immediately distinguishes itself, something that feels like it's craving out its own identity, this first region doesn't really do that yet. Right now it feels like groundwork, solid, functional groundwork, but still very much within the boundaries of what this genre already does. Calling this the ending of the first region doesn't really feel accurate. It's more of a temporary wrap-up, a pause rather than a conclusion. The story resolves the immediate situation, but it very clearly isn't trying to provide answers. Instead, it leaves you with more questions than you started with. And honestly, that part works. It feels intentional. This is still early and the game is more interested in setting future threads than tying things off neatly. Where my reaction starts to shift a bit is with the way the central antagonist is handled. Structurally, there's nothing wrong here, the scene does what it needs to do. The villain is introduced, positioned as a long-term presence, and exits in a way that keeps them relevant for later arcs. From a purely functional standpoint, it works. Creatively though, this is where my excitement dipped. The antagonist has a clear opportunity to end things, to decisively deal with the protagonist in their group, and simply doesn't. They leave. And while I'm sure the story will eventually justify that decision, the moment itself feels familiar in a way that's hard to ignore. This isn't about bad writing, it's about a choice that's been used so often that it lost a lot of its impact. We've reached a point where villains not taking decisive action has become almost expected, especially in gacha storytelling. The antagonist isn't allowed to fully win, not because it wouldn't make sense, but because the story needs them around. And while that's understandable on a meta level, it can feel creatively weak in the moment. A big part of that ties into how modern stories, gacha games in particular, tend to approach villains now. The emphasis is almost always in sympathy, hesitation, moral complexity. This isn't inherently bad, but when it constantly results in villains backing off instead of committing, it starts to feel predictable. I'm not going to dig too deeply into that here because that's a conversation worth having on its own. But in this case, it did lower my anticipation slightly. Not enough to disengage, but enough to make the wrap-up feel less sharp than it could have been. The region ends cleanly, it set up the future, it does what it needs to do, but this particular creative choice reminded me that even when the foundations are solid, familiarity can still dull the moment. So after finishing the first region, where does this leave me? Honestly, in a pretty neutral space, and I don't mean that negatively. I enjoyed the story, I was engaged while playing it, and I'm interested enough in the world and the direction it's hinting at that I'm going to keep going. At the same time, this region didn't leave me with a strong emotional high or a sense of urgency to see what happens next. It feels more like the story has finished introducing itself rather than making a statement. The foundations are there, the tone is clear, and the pacing is solid, but the narrative hasn't fully asserted its identity yet. And maybe that's fine. This still feels like a prologue, a setting in period, the moment where the story makes sure you understand the world before it asks you to care deeply about these conflicts. Whatever that approach pays off depends entirely on what comes next. For now, Endfield has done enough to keep me playing, but not enough to truly surprise me. I'm interested, but cautious. Curious, but not fully invested yet. What matters is what the story chooses to do with the groundwork it's laid here. If future regions build on it with stronger stakes, clearer antagonists, and more confident narrative choices, there's a real potential here. If they don't, then this first region will probably be remembered as exactly what it feels like right now. A competent beginning, nothing more, nothing less. If you've played through the first region yourself, I'm genuinely curious where you landed on it. Did it work for you? Did it leave you wanting more? Or did it feel mostly like a setup? For me, this is one of those stories where the real test hasn't happened yet. The question is whatever the game actually builds something interesting on top of it, or just keep circling familiar grounds. Either way, I'll keep playing for now, and I'll keep talking about it as the story unfolds. If you enjoy this kind of slow narrative focused review, feel free to like the video or subscribe. And if you disagree with any of this, that's fine too, just keep it civil. Thanks for watching.